Chelsea, you want to take it away?
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to have everybody here. We're very thrilled to have Bennet here to teach us about our rights when it comes to being organizers and also attendees. A little bit about myself. My name is Chelsea B. Davis. I go by Chelsea, or Veggies Do It Better. And I am one half of the organizing team. My co-organizer, Serena Farb, is here of Born Vegan. And we are really thrilled to be putting on the first annual Vegan Earth Day March happening on Earth Day this year, which is April 22nd. And part of that is supporting our city organizers. We are looking at having around 50 cities around the world join us this year. And we wanted to be sure that everybody was fully prepared for what it takes to both organize a march and participate in a march. So part of that is having a training like this, which is Know Your Rights for organizers. And then we are hoping to have a Know Your Rights for attendees in April. So to go over a little bit more about the march itself and to introduce herself, I'm going to pass it over to Serena, my co-organizer, and then she's going to introduce Bennet, who's going to do his talk. It's going to be a little more interactive. You're going to be able to ask questions through the chat. And at the end, we're going to be talking about some sponsorship and volunteer opportunities for the march as well.
Thank you, Chelsea. So yes, I'm Serena Farb, and organizing the Vegan Earth Day March with Chelsea, and we're really excited. We've been working on this for many months. So just for if there's some of you here who may not know much about the purpose of the march, you know, we're really trying to transform the food system, and we have, you know, three very sort of specific demands of how, you know, the food system and climate and environmental issues are all connected. So that's where we get the Vegan Earth Day March, and our demands are really, you know, we want individuals that can to go vegan and essentially boycott the meat and dairy industry. And then we want governments to stop subsidizing the meat and dairy industries, take away subsidies, and to level the playing field so that they stop unfairly propping up that system. And then we also, and we're partnering with Plant-Based Treaty and the Animal Save movement. And so we are also asking that government institutions, local government, city government, nonprofits, NGOs also endorse and take action on the Plant-Based Treaty to help facilitate the transition to a sustainable plant-based food system. So that's what we're here today. And so the Vegan Earth Day March, you know, we'll have cities all around the world all marching on the same day. And some of what we're encouraging for our organizers is, you know your city and your area best. So it's picking, you know, maybe local targets like city government or a city hall or the mayor or somebody to demand that they take action locally on some issue or policy that's relevant or endorse the plant-based treaty, you know. So we're leaving it fairly open to organizers to kind of take the vision and demands and make them, you know, best fit their city and area. So with that, we are so excited to have Bennet Zurofsky here with us today, and he has dedicated his life to advancing causes of labor and peace and social justice as a lawyer and musician and activist. He regularly provides a lot of pro bono services to activists working for change and has done a lot of work assisting organizers and, you know, demonstrators in standing their ground and knowing their rights, which is what we're here today to talk about. Since Donald Trump's election, he's represented more demonstrators on a pro bono basis in municipal court than any other attorney in New Jersey. And when he's not in the office, you can also find him on the picket line as well. So welcome, Bennet, and thank you so much for being here and sharing information on knowing our rights today.
Thank you very much, Serena. Thank you for—
and let me add one more thing too. Yeah, if everyone can please put your questions in the chat, we'll be watching that and asking them, you know, as we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serena. It's a pleasure to be with all of you this early afternoon, although I guess it might be morning for some of you if you're not on the East Coast still. I am a lawyer, and I'm here as a lawyer. I'm not actually a vegan. I'm maybe a fellow traveler. My son and daughter-in-law are vegans who operate a organic vegetable farm in Kerhonkson, New York. If you're ever up at the Beacon or Kingston farmers markets, you might patronize them. They're called Long Season Farm. That's in New York State. I do quite a bit of work with people who want to demonstrate in the streets. And that's one of the most basic rights that we have in this country. And it's unfortunate that a lot of public authorities tend to view it as something other than a basic right and something that always requires police attention, and they try and limit it. The basic law of the country is, though, that you have a right to gather. It's not just your right of speech, it's your freedom of association, and it's the freedom to petition the government, all three of which are incorporated in the First Amendment of the Constitution, and similar rights, often the identical language, appears in the constitutions of both states. Now, that's been held by the US Supreme Court to mean that the streets and the sidewalks, really any public place, is a proper forum, or at least is a forum in which free speech may take place, subject to what are known as reasonable time, place, and manner regulations. And that's, of course, where the rub is, and that's where there is often conflict. Now, certain things, though, are pretty clear. And how much you have to be concerned about your rights depends on what exactly you hope to be doing, how many people you expect to have attend, and where exactly you intend to do it. Those are the big factors. So if, for example, you just have a group of maybe 20 people who want to gather on a sidewalk someplace and either march to another location, staying on the sidewalk and abiding by all the laws that apply to pedestrians, such as stopping if you have a red light and not jaywalking or the like, you should have no trouble whatsoever, unless it's an unusually hostile local government. On a meeting like this, I don't think you should face any problem. Your causes are promoting veganism, and also, as I understand it, you're planning to do on Earth Day. You're promoting an environmental cause. I think that there's no reason to be particularly concerned. If you were running a demonstration where you were saying the police should be defunded, or the police have engaged in improper brutality, or something focused on the police, no matter how small you are, you have to be concerned that you might face repression. But the fact is, on your causes, a lot of the police officers may agree with you. And it's certainly not something that's going to arouse their ire. So, as I said, if you're walking in on a sidewalk, your group isn't too big, you should have no problem whatsoever, and I wouldn't be very concerned. If you get bigger and you feel you need to walk in the streets because your crowd is so big, it won't fit on the sidewalk, and you want to march as part of your event, then you're almost certainly going to have to deal with the police in some way, because you're going to want cars to stop and whatever. They may come after you as obstructing traffic. it's not clear that you are obstructing traffic. In a lot of places, you're allowed to walk in the street. Many places there aren't even sidewalks. And if you're continuing to move, there's an argument that that they should just let you keep moving, that's the least disruptive thing for them to be doing. So again, it depends where you are. But many towns and cities have permit requirements. But before I get to that, let me just say one other thing. If you're not marching, if you're standing in front of a particular location that you want to demonstrate in, and it's not something like a park, it's a problem if you are blocking ingress or egress to somebody's building, or if you're blocking other people from being able to use the sidewalk, for example. There's so many people that they can't get through. So if you're in a single place, you have to be concerned that you're not preventing any of the ordinary lawful use of that area, such as other people walking down the sidewalk, or other people using the street, and certainly not people going in and out. No matter how few you are, if you decide to do a sit-in to block access, let's say you're demonstrating in front of one of the big international meatpacking companies. You're not, if you're preventing people from getting in and out, you have to expect to be running into interference from the police and possibly even subject to arrest, because you're not allowed to block entrance to somebody's building or exit from somebody's building without their permission. You know.
What about if they're not blocking a building, but a group of people are gathering stationary in a public park? Is that allowed?
Well, a public park is a public place. It depends. It might depend on where you are. In general, you should be free to gather in a public park. If there's a picnic area or a field that's not in use and it hasn't been reserved by someone else. You know, a lot of parks, there are areas that are generally open to the public, but for example, if it's a picnic area, you can reserve the tables. And if you're interfering with someone who has reserved the tables in advance and you're not the ones who had reserved the tables, then you have a problem. If it's a ball field, like in Central Park in New York, there are quite a few ball fields, but they're all reserved by various teams that come in. There's a method and people could do it. So if someone previously has reserved the use, or if it's something regulated in that way and you haven't done it, you might have a problem. In general, if it's a public park and you're not trampling vegetation that they're trying to cultivate, more than a lawn. I mean, some public parks have lovely garden areas where they're very careful of, that goes to time, place, and manner regulations, which are reasonable. But for that, you can go. And there's also a doctrine, even places that might ordinarily need a permit, if something sudden arises and it's like a spontaneous demonstration that you couldn't have possibly planned even 24 hours in advance, there are a lot of courts that have held that these normal rules will go away. If, for example, you keep coming back to police misconduct, but that's the best recent example. The George Floyd video hits the internet and everybody's upset, and an organization is quickly organized. Even if you're in a place that would ordinarily require a permit, there's an understanding that there's a right to spontaneous demonstration. Now, you, of course, it's now 3 months in advance or 2 months in advance of the date that you're trying to go forward. So you don't have that sort of an excuse. So it's important to look at what regulations might affect your event. And I always recommend that you try to comply with them as closely as you can. So for example, depending upon what city you're in, what town you're in, there might be an ordinance that's required for parade. Again, this only applies if you think that you're going to have to walk in the street. I mean, if you're just walking in the sidewalk, a lot depends on how big you are. It's a good idea to try and apply. Now, when you apply for a permit, number one, it makes it easier to publicize. And some people don't like to apply for a permit because they think that's going to alert the police and the authorities when you may not really wish to have the police alerted to it, and you don't necessarily want to share with the government what your plans are. The problem is that if you're going to do a good job publicizing your event so that you get people out, you can be sure that they're going to find out about it anyway. And in a sense, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Well, I guess you folks don't want to catch flies, but you do better by going to them, especially if you're not planning civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is another category. But if you're not planning civil disobedience, it's usually best to go to the relevant authorities, tell them what you're planning to do, say you're planning to be entirely peaceful and lawful and expressing your opinion. I mean, not that you might not make a lot of noise, but that you're not going, there's no plan to engage in any disruption of the ordinary business of the town or the area that you're in, other than the fact that you'll be there. And if you're in the street, there's going to be some effect on traffic or something, but also for your own safety. If you're cooperating with the local authorities and you've agreed upon a route, then they're going to help protect you with that route. So some person who thinks that they have a right to drive their car no matter what else is going on isn't going to be ramming into you or pushing you from behind, honking their horn, trying to force their way through your event. Now, again, your cause is not likely to have that ire, but when I look at these MAGA folks around the country, some of whom believe that eating red meat is core to their personality, and how dare you suggest there's something wrong with eating red meat. I mean, many of them grew up torturing cats, so they're not exactly anti-vivisectionists, and it's not beyond the imagination that there might be some people out there who would get upset. Like I said, your cause is not real likely to do that. But if you are marching in the street, there are a lot of drivers who just can't stand the fact that sometimes people have the right to use the street, and they try and force their way through. And it's helpful if you have the police who will, perhaps put a police car behind the last marcher so that nobody is going to be able to do that sort of thing, who might stop the traffic as you come to intersections so that you can walk freely across without worrying about people coming down the side streets and that sort of thing. So it's something that I recommend. Now, to say that I recommend a permit does not mean that I recommend full compliance with everything that some of these towns and cities have. You should get a hold of the ordinance. You should meet as soon as possible with whoever's in charge of doing it and see what they have. But sometimes they try to have insurance requirements. where if they're going to give you a permit, you have to post some fantastically large amount of insurance. Those requirements are generally unconstitutional, especially if you are not engaged in a commercial enterprise, such as running a fair. You know how these fairs come in and set up in town parks. It might be proper to allow that sort of enterprise to have insurance. But if people just want to go in the street to express a protected First Amendment viewpoint, that's not the sort of thing that should require insurance. It's also not the sort of thing to require you to hire the police, to hire overtime police or pay for overtime police. Those sorts of financial requirements are not there. It is their responsibility to protect your right to speak. You're the ones, you're not endangering anybody. You're not violating any law. If the town thinks it requires extra police, that's the town's business. They're free to decide that, but they're not free to require you to pay for it. That's their duty. They also may have restrictions and say, well, you can march here, but you can't march there. And sometimes the places that they want you to march are very obscure places. Now, you know, this is within reason. There's some room for differing, and, you know, you see it in the way parade permits are given out in many places. But in theory, no place is entirely off limits. But if you're saying you want to have your march in the busiest part of town, right at the hour when it's busiest, and they're saying no, they might end up prevailing in a court if you had an argument, unless there was a really important need for you to be there and you couldn't communicate what you wanted to communicate. I mean, if that's where the headquarters of the Armor Corporation is, and you really want to have your demonstration right in front of Armor because they're the big meat packer and they're the bigger place in town, and you want people to see you when they're not all in other places, but when they're coming out of work and they're going to see your demonstration, then they really can't say, no, you absolutely can't be there in front of the Armor Meatpacking Company's international headquarters, even if it isn't a very big part of town, because that's important to the nature of your speech. That's important to the nature of your speech. So again, a lot of this has to do with your planning. You know, in New York City, for example, you see a lot of marches on Fifth Avenue. Where on Fifth Avenue they're set up often depends on the season and what's going on and what particular sites have some significance to the marchers or something. In other towns, like in Newark, New Jersey, where I do a lot of my work, there are certain groups which march so regularly and do things so regularly. We had a group called the Newark Anti-Violence Coalition. They were roughly allied with the police because they weren't protesting against the police, but they were complaining about how many shootings there were in the community, and you know, lack of law enforcement and lack of community members respecting each other. They would intentionally tie up traffic, and they would go every week. They would go to a busy intersection, and they wouldn't, you know, move. And it came to the point where the police just didn't try to stop them from doing that, even when they were in the busiest intersections of town, because they knew that they were going to do it and they were going to be there every week. And although it was always a different intersection, eventually they started telling the police, and the police would, you know, kind of cooperate with it. But you're only doing a one-time event right now. So you can't develop that staying power by insisting on what you're doing back in, you know, week after week. And if you go and you know that they're telling you not to go someplace, there's a likelihood that they may end up arresting you, even though you might eventually win up in court that what they were doing was a violation of the First Amendment. If you start early enough and they're saying that, you can go to court and maybe get an injunction and get a judge to determine whether you have the right. But if you're not going to do that and they're saying no and you're saying yes, that's the type of scene where it could lead to arrests or worse. And of course, the greater numbers you have, the more you can do. If you're a small group, it's not a problem for the police to arrest you. If you got a few hundred people, if they're going to try and detain a few hundred people for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, in their opinion, they got to bring in over 100 police officers probably to do that. And they don't want to do that. So the bigger your group, the more you can get away with. I mean, I represented demonstrators. It was an environmental cause. I forget what. We wanted to be in an office park because all the buildings where these people were in this office park, which was behind acres of green grass and stuff like that. And we just told the police, look, we expect a few thousand people. You have this nice green grassy area, which is where we think we should be. If you don't let us be there, and you talk to the property owner too, don't let us be there, we're all going to be in the street, jamming traffic for who knows how long. It'll be a much more dangerous situation because I can assure you we're going to have a few thousand people there. And, you can get a lot of what you might not otherwise be able to get or what you might not have a legal right to. We had no legal right to be on that private property where we wanted to be. But it was better for all concerned if they let us be there, because anything else was more likely to be a chaotic situation. So you want to think through as far as advanced as you can what you would like to do, and then go and talk to the authorities. If you're able to do some research, usually local ordinances are easy enough to find. They're now available on the internet. It used to be very difficult to find them, but virtually every municipality now posts them on the internet, and they're pretty easy to find. See what they are, get your own idea as to whether they have anything. A lot of times they don't have anything. And the police just start things. If they don't have anything, the police for purposes of order can try and be helpful and for your purposes, but they can't just say no, 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 because they can't do it on an ad hoc basis. There are cases that were developed on that. You can't decide your permit requirements depending upon what group is here. You got to have an ordinance or something set up in advance that this is the rule book. That was established by the folks who were demonstrating for civil rights in the in the South back in the 50s and the 60s. A lot of this law was established by them, and to my chagrin, a lot of the more recent law has been established by the anti-abortion protesters, who have been vigorous. There are three things that help establish this law: the anti-abortion protesters recently, the civil rights folks in the 50s and 60s, and interestingly, the Jehovah's Witnesses, although that's more on your right to leaflet and go up into homes, because they were sometimes harassed. So wherever it comes from, they can't just do it ad hoc. They have to have it in advance. It should be published.
Okay, we've got two questions I want to jump in and ask before we keep going. This is going back a little ways, but to blocking access to things and police. What if activists aren't blocking access anywhere, but you end up having a bunch of spectators or other people, and the result, they're there to watch or see what you're doing, and they're blocking access? Can you get in trouble for that?
Well, police can charge anybody with anybody they want, and then you fight it out in court. If it's literally just spectators, you're having a demonstration, a lot of people come around and watching, you're probably not. But if you've applied for permits and stuff, that should be taken into account. It's very rare. You would have to have, if you're on a reasonably busy street, which has reasonably sized sidewalks, and you're marching, as opposed to putting on a puppet show or some sort of demonstration that gathers an audience, it's very hard to imagine how your spectators are going to be so large as to be blocking access to things. I mean, even the Macy's parade in New York City doesn't prevent people from going into the stores that are along the parade route. It may make it a little bit difficult, but you know, that's not likely. You know, the question is, if you have a more radical faction within your group that decides to do something beyond your plan and they get involved, will the people come after the organizers as well? Sometimes they do. They usually can't succeed. But in my experience, what the police most want to do is to remove the obstruction. They don't want to cast any wider net than they need to. The wider the net they cast, the more difficult it is for them. And the more dangerous it is to the public at large. And the more dangerous it is to them. Because the more people they're trying to hassle, the more likely somebody's going to act up. Or somebody's going to get hurt. And they need more people. So if a group of 4 people decide to sit in front of a steakhouse that, you know, prides itself on how red their steaks are and how many they sell each day, the police are probably going to want to arrest those 4 people, and they're not going to really want to arrest anybody else. They're going to want people to back off, and if someone's refusing to back off, they may take them up, but it's not a likely result. Is it an impossible result? No. And if all hell breaks loose at your event, which doesn't seem at all likely for this sort of event, then they often come after the organizers because it's too hard to figure out who actually did it. So you blame the organizers. I mean, that's the most famous example of that are the Haymarket martyrs from the late 19th century, where quite a riot broke out, perhaps because the police started it, and a policeman or 2 got killed in the exchange of fire, because there's definitely fire coming from both sides. And organizers of the demonstration were put on trial for murder, and I think one of them was hung. One or maybe more than one was hung. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility, but it's very unlikely.
What about, has there been any, like there have been some anti-protesting legislation that's been proposed in some US cities and towns? So what's going on with that? And is that constitutional, or how does that affect people when they're planning stuff?
It's absolutely constitutional protest legislation. That's one of the most basic parts of the right. That's why you have the right to petition the government.
Right, the legislation that's anti-protesters, like there's are you familiar?
Yes, yeah, like in Florida and stuff like that. That is unconstitutional legislation as far as I'm concerned. But the police may feel free to act in accordance with that legislation. That's another reason why you need to talk to the authorities unless you want to be disrupted. You know, I represent a lot of demonstrators who want to be arrested because that gets more attention to their cause. Okay, but if you don't want to be arrested, that's one of the reasons why you want to talk to the police. You know, what I always say to the police, what I always say to demonstrators is, look, if you're doing a good job publicizing your things to get a lot of people out, you're not just a small unit that's planning some sort of action. If you want to get people out, the police are going to know about it anyway, and they're likely going to show up. And what I also say to them is, you have problems with the police when they're caught by surprise. You may have if you're in a big city, the police departments have units which specialize in dealing with demonstrations. You know, and these folks know how to deal with demonstrators. They're reasonable people. You could talk to them. They try to work things out. They try to keep things peaceful. They try to keep things moving. You know, if you say you're going to be there, I mean, we were running demonstrations with the Poor People's Campaign a few years ago at the State House in New Jersey. And then we get a permit which said, well, we're going to be here from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And then the police were real nice, but a bunch of them decided, well, once it was 3 o'clock, they were going to chase everybody out, which I think was ridiculous and I think was unconstitutional, but that's what they did, right? No problem at all until they did that. And in that case, the organizers decided they weren't going to argue with the police, although either lawyer was telling them that they should.
What about, oh, go ahead.
Well, the most dangerous thing is to surprise police, because you don't know who the police officers are who are going to be making the first decisions and what their reaction may be. You may get a very young and inexperienced cop who doesn't know what your rights are, because believe me, they don't teach them in police academy. You know, you may get someone on the desk who doesn't like what you're doing and takes a hard approach. You know, a lot of this varies from what city you are and, you know, what the attitude of the police are. You're much better off if you don't surprise them. Even if you don't agree with them as what you're going to do, I tell them, well, we're going to do what we're going to do, but you're still not surprising them. And then, you know, even if the police are deciding to arrest you, it's going to go more smoothly if they're not caught by surprise and they don't feel outnumbered. You know, that's when police get dangerous. If they think they want to arrest 20 people and there are only 2 of them. Because, you know, it's very difficult for 2 officers to arrest 20 people if those 20 people don't want to cooperate, and especially if there are other people around. So my recommendation is that you talk to them in advance, especially, you know, you're going 2 months in advance. You know, now sometimes they also have these requirements. Oh, you have to apply for a permit some lengthy distance in advance. That's nonsense. What I always say is find out what their requirements are, look at them, comply as much as possible for what you really want to do, but don't compromise the core of what you need to do. Tell them, okay, you say we got to do A, B, C, and D. We're willing to do A, B, C, A, B, and C, but we're not going to do D. And we think we have a right not to do D in this circumstance. But do as much as possible and be open with them. Be open with them. And that's why the last thing that we listed here is the importance of having local counsel. There are 2 times when attorneys can be most helpful: before the event and after the event. Because before the event, you're negotiating with the authorities as to what you're going to do, and they're saying no, and you're saying yes. And, you know, attorneys can help you. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be attorneys. If you have political leaders who are involved with your cause, you know, community people have some standing with the police, you know, negotiate. And afterwards, if there are arrests and things, we can come in and defend you and try and see if we can beat the charges or make the penalties as small as possible or do whatever. During the event, there's not much we can do. If a police officer starts to do something and I walk up to him as an attorney and say, I don't think you're doing the right thing, they might listen to me, they might not listen to me, they might push me aside, they might say, I'm going to arrest you for interfering with arrests if you don't get out of my way. You know, there's a lot of things. they want control of the situation when they want control. And that's their big thing, which is why it's helpful to tell them what's going on, so they don't think you're out of control. So attorneys can help you negotiate, tell you what you might be able to get away with, what you might not be able to get away with. And ideally, they know the territory. If you're doing this in a big town like New York City or San Francisco or Washington, D.C. or Los Angeles or Chicago, you know, there are people who have experience with demonstrations. There are people who know the ways of the police, you know, and you can work it out very often, or be prepared. It's important to know the territory. I mean, as I understand what you're planning, you really shouldn't anticipate any major problems if you go forward and, you know, talk to them and be well planned. How to find local counsel? You should look within your own ranks. You'll often find that you have attorneys, and even if they don't themselves do that type of work, they may be interested in doing it for your cause, or they may be able to refer you to sympathetic people. You might check the directory of the National Lawyers Guild, or contact National Lawyers Guild. I think if you go on their webpage, they have like a committee that tries to help demonstrators and things like that. The final thing I want to say in terms of self-protection and things, if you're concerned, it is great to be sure that you have some people who are going to stay out of trouble, but are going to videotape, and are going to videotape as much as possible. Nothing has helped to fight police abuse as much as videotape. If the police know you're videotaping, and that's an established right, you have a right to videotape officers on the street, you know, while they're doing their thing. A lot of them think you don't. There were a bunch of arrests a few years ago where police smashed cameras and things. But all the cases that have done it have said you can do it, subject to the right of the police to establish a reasonable police line around their activity. They're allowed to tell everybody to be back, etc. But, you know, the most dramatic example of that was George Floyd. That young woman did a videotape, and while it didn't prevent the police misconduct, it led to significant consequences that never, ever would have happened if she just tried to tell the story to the police about what she saw. You know, it was the videotape, and that's an important thing to observe, especially if you're having trouble. Plus, you know, you might want to live stream your march. A lot of that stuff is, you know, worthwhile, but live streaming your march is not quite the same as somebody who's along the route, and if he sees a cop hassling someone, kind of comes closer and starts to videotape what's going on. That isn't necessarily what you want to live stream, you know, about your event, but it would be a valuable thing to have if it turns into an ugly situation. I think I've said what I've been planning to say. I think we got at least 15 minutes left for questions or discussions, which I'd be happy to have. I have not looked into the chat, but I believe that Serena has. So I don't know if you've got some things lined up, or I guess if you raise your hand, either Serena or I will call on you.
Yeah. So if you raise your hand and signal on there and you want to ask questions. I did have a question, which was, if you've alerted the police, or you're planning a march and you want to do like a die-in in the middle of an intersection for like, 2 minutes or something like that, is that type of thing, do you think that's still good to like let them know beforehand that you're planning on doing that, and just say like, we'll be out of here, and just let us finish doing this speak out or this thing for something like that?
I would let them know, or even on the scene. I mean, you may I should have said this before. It's a good idea to designate among you someone who's going to be a liaison with the police and will alert them to what you're doing, or that will be in touch with the leaders of your demonstration. And that liaison should identify themselves to whoever is the police officer in charge. There's usually someone in charge, and say, you know, if something's going on that's giving you a problem, talk to me and I'll bring it to the leaders and maybe we can work it out. The police don't want to make arrests, especially of a group like you, which I basically call good citizen demonstrators. Nobody's going to think you're a band of criminals. You know, you're upset about this thing and you may be doing some things that aren't entirely within the law, but you're not a criminal gang, right? The police don't want to arrest people like you. And if you're doing a die-in in an intersection, you expect to last 2 minutes. If they try and arrest you all, they're going to tie up that intersection for a lot more than 2 minutes. So if they know, maybe if not in advance, if at least the police liaison tells them, hey, you know, these people have decided what they're going to do. They're going to do this. They're going to lie in the street for 2 minutes and then they're going to get up. You know, the police are probably going to say, oh, well, we don't really like it, but what are we going to do about it? You know, as long as they really get up in 2 or 3 minutes. You know, whereas if you just do that and you catch the police by surprise, who knows what their reaction might be. They're saying, hey, this is supposed to be a march. You're not allowed to do that. And they may wade in. So I recommend that you do tell them. I think you really have to have a very good reason not to tell them. You know, again, a lot depends on your local police departments. You know, if you have local people, who have experience, they may say otherwise, but that's been my experience. I mean, I've had several demonstrations over the years where I've had to convince the cops that they have to arrest the people sitting in because they're just not going to leave unless they get arrested. And my job, rather than preventing the arrest, is to convince the police that that's really what they have to do. Because for the most part, they don't want to make these arrests. It ties them up, and it's not their image to be, their image is that they're these big tough guys who take on criminals. Oh, we're going to arrest this vegan who wanted to sit down in front of the officers of armor and block the door for a half hour, an hour, 2 hours. You know, that's not their self-image. They're not anxious to do that. They're not anxious to do that. Because then they got to go to court, they got to do this, they got to do that. Oh yeah, these horrifying vegans, we had to arrest them. I mean, it's, it's not their thing. It's not their thing.
Continuing the conversation about communication with the police, Lucy is asking, at what march size on a sidewalk do you need to let the police know? Do you recommend talking to them even for a small demonstration like that, maybe just a rally, or only talking to them if you're going to be marching in the street?
Well, there's no rule of thumb. I mean, and a lot depends on the size of the sidewalks and how disruptive your march is going to be to other pedestrians and things like that. If you're going to have a group of any size, I am always in favor of letting the police know, because I don't see the advantage of not letting them know. And I don't think police ever like to be taken by surprise. But if a group just gathers, I mean, think about it. If you were decided to meet a bunch of friends and then you were all going to go over to some restaurant and have a meal together, and maybe there's 20 of you and you have a demonstrate, and you're all walking down the street together, you wouldn't notify the police, right? You wouldn't do anything. You just get together and you'd walk. You might be milling around on the corner. I mean, think of what the students do after school. You might have 20, 30 kids around. In most towns, the police aren't going to hassle them because they're all hanging out and heading down to wherever they are, or walking home in a big group. I mean, it's no different than that. Just because you're holding picket signs or chanting, it's not a different activity. But my feeling is if you're publicizing the event, the odds are they're going to pick up on it anyway. So I don't see the advantage to not telling them. I mean, I don't think you should ask for a permit. A lot of towns have permit requirements for loudspeakers, and those are constitutional. So no matter what your group is, if you're planning on using the megaphone, a lot of towns do require you to register. That's how, for example, in Newark, we litigated over their parade ordinances, and we got something that they can't require. We got them to agree that they wouldn't require a permit for any group that was smaller than 50 people, right? But they always had a sound ordinance which required you to notify them and maybe get a permit for using a loudspeaker of any sort. And that kind of lets them know what's going on in town if people comply with that. Now, I've never known anybody to get arrested if that was their only violation, was they were violating the noise ordinance. But if they didn't register in advance, it gives the cop a legitimate license to come up and hassle who's ever controlling your loudspeaker and say, hey, you're not allowed to do that, and maybe even convince you they got to turn it off because there's a legitimate ordinance. So it's important to know, again, what the ordinances are and to make conscious decisions as to what you're going to comply with and what you're not going to comply with.
So I've got another question then. What do you recommend if police are threatening to arrest you and or have good idea that it's an intimidation tactic or they don't have a right? Like, this is something that I have experienced personally in New York with Kaporos activism. And we had another lawyer at the time who told us that there's a decent chance they were just trying to intimidate us to get us to move. We did move. There's a decent chance that they actually would have arrested us. If they did, we could have fought it in court and would have very likely been proven, that we were right, because it was pretty obvious. And we didn't want to risk that. But yeah, what is your recommendation? Like, if the police are saying, like, you have to move or we're going to arrest you, do you recommend just complying, even if they're absolutely in the wrong?
Well, I think your choice is, this is the law. Even if the cop is wrong in arresting you, it's a crime and it can be a serious one if you interfere with the arrest or resist the arrest. Okay? So if they're going to arrest you, your choice is if they're saying move on or we're going to arrest you, your choice is to either move on or to get arrested. But if you're going to get arrested, I recommend that you be entirely cooperative once they tell you that you're under arrest. Now, when that happens, when police tell demonstrators to move on, I often recommend that they say, as respectfully as possible to the officer, I believe we have a right to what we're doing, and we're going to stay here unless you're telling me that you're going to arrest us. You should call their bluff and put up and shut up. If they say that we're going to arrest you if you're not out of here, within the next 5 minutes or something, and then you see them basically getting ready to do that, you should do it. In these circumstances, police will almost always give a warning before they make the arrest if you're nonviolent demonstrators. In New Jersey, this is incorporated in our law of trespass. Let's say you're on private property, not necessarily in the street, where in order to make a good arrest, the police officer has to be able to prove that you knew that you had no right to be on that property at that time. So the practice is with almost virtually all police officers to use their megaphone and say, you are trespassing, you have no right to be there. The property owner does not want you there. Anybody who is still, I'm giving you a chance to leave the property without being arrested. And anybody who's still on this property, in such and such a time, they're going to get arrested. And even then, if they're walking over with the handcuffs and everybody that leaves the property, generally they won't do anything. It's usually the same thing in the street. They're going to make an announcement to the group, and there's almost always the opportunity to disperse. What I don't recommend is doing anything to resist the arrest, because sometimes the police officers will then charge you with resisting arrest, and that's a considerably more serious charge than you're likely to face for, let's say, obstructing traffic or, jaywalking, or something of the sort. You don't want to do that. And, if you're sitter-inners, again, it's good to have a police liaison. Like if you're sitter-inners who are not going to get up when they tell you to get up and you're going to have to carry it out, it's a good thing if the police know that they're going to have to lift you up physically and carry you out. The police, the liaison can communicate things that can be helpful. But again, that's if you're planning civil disobedience, that's a different session than the one we're having today. And I guess my most important message is to plan what you're doing well, so you know exactly what you're likely to face. And to the greatest extent possible, try and cooperate with the authorities so there are no surprises, and so that they may in fact help you out. If you're having a parade and you're in a big city, it's very helpful to have the police helping to clear the intersections, helping to get, protect you against the traffic, etc. Play to the part. Police officers' self-image is that they're the citizen's friend. Unless the citizen turns out to be the type of person they decide they is the enemy. So, play up to that. Play up to that. I mean, the idea of an Earth Day demonstration is not likely to get a police department up in arms.
Great. Thank you so much, Bennet. I did want to mention we will be having a police liaison training on March 26th. Yeah. So that's a Sunday. It's going to be at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so that will help continue on this conversation. I also wanted to ask quickly your thoughts on people having a legal advisor, when that's appropriate, at what scale you want to have a legal advisor, and maybe some resources that you recommend people using to find a local legal advisor.
Well, if you're going to have a big permit fight with the police department, it's a good idea to have a lawyer to help you out with that. I expect your group does not have very much money, so you're not in a good position to hire attorneys. These types of issues, the ACLU, and now the ACLU is in all 50 states. They didn't used to be. You should certainly talk to the ACLU office. That I would say is the first place to go. The ACLU will not necessarily represent you in court if you have defendant, then you might have to, well, if you're facing real criminal charges, it's very hard to find pro bono representation. In municipal court, I'm not the only guy in the country who does it for free for demonstrators, but your best place to find them is from your own ranks, from your own sympathizers. If you're a group of any size, you will most certainly have some attorneys among your group, or you have people in your group who are the spouse or the son or the father or the mother, of a or a cousin of somebody who might be sympathetic. you know, that's a good place to start. But on this law that I'm talking about, if you're having a problem and you don't have someone from with your own ranks who feels competent to do it, you should definitely reach out to the ACLU. If you're in a big city, they've been through it before, and they may say, oh, well, this is what the deal is with this city. That's your best spot. Now, you announced the police liaison training. Were you expecting me to do that? Because I don't remember agreeing to that program. I'm not saying I wouldn't, but I don't remember agreeing to do it. Okay.
You're off the hook this time, but it's good to know that you also offer that for the future.
Well, I offer a lot of things to groups whose cause I basically agree with. That's a way I can be helpful. So, yeah, I think I just saw folks, National Lawyers Guild can be helpful. They're not always, depending upon the city, there aren't that many guild lawyers out there, though. You know, I think if you're in New York, if you're in Philadelphia, if you're in San Francisco, Los Angeles, you're probably okay. But even there, I would start with the ACLU for these issues. If the ACLU becomes involved, they don't charge a fee.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's a couple minutes after 10, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time, especially yours, Bennet. Thank you so much for joining us today and educating us on this really important topic. So like we were talking about before, this session was geared towards organizers, and then we are hoping to have an additional Know Your Rights training in April that is geared towards attendees. So I know there was somebody who had a question about like, what should you bring to a protest, what you shouldn't? We'll be going over that later. There were also some questions in the chat, more specifically about organizing. If you are currently an organizer of the Vegan Earth Day March, you should have access to our city organizer packet. If you are not yet an organizer and you're interested in learning more about that, or potentially being connected to other people in your area that are already organizing or interested in organizing, you could co-host with them. I did just put a link in the chat for that interest form. I also added in the chat a link to our open info session that's going to be this afternoon or evening, depending on, or morning, really, depending on your time zone. So that's at 7 p.m. Eastern time, and that'll be a very informal chat with Serena and I, just going over any questions you might have. We can go over route planning or different roles that you want to have, make sure that you have filled within your organizing team, etc. And what else did I put in the chat? We also just started a GoFundMe. We have a $20,000 matching grant that we are very excited about. So that means every dollar that is given will be matched. So please do give generously. This is a very grassroots project that Serena and I have been working really hard on, and we really want to raise enough money to give all the organizers and the cities the resources that they need, both with trainings and physical resources like banners and flyers and such. We also want to thank our partners. We would not be able to be doing this project at this scale without Animal Safe Movement, also Climate Safe Movement, Plant-Based Treaty, Climate Healers and Food Healers, and Unchained TV. Serena, do you want to add anything before we say goodbye?
I think you covered most of it. If anyone has any specific questions about their march in their city, feel free to reach out me. I'm happy to meet one-on-one with cities that have, you know, concerns or want to have me meet with their whole organizing team. So feel free to email me, Serena, and our emails are Serena at Vegan Earth Day March and Chelsea at Vegan Earth Day March. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming. And oh, and I'll add, for organizers that are in the closed organizer Facebook group, a recording of this will be shared there and in the resource folder as well. So with that,
I want to wish you all the best of luck in pulling this off. I hope we have gigantic Earth Day events all around the country.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and information with us today.
You're welcome. Happy to have been here.